She said I'm the co-chair along with Dr. Aramburu, who is also on with me today, or on with us today. And I'm really excited for today's topic and speaker. So we have Dr. Anita Patel. She is a pediatric critical care specialist at Children's National. She's also on the clinical and academic faculty at George Washington University. She's a native of the DMV, hails from McLean, did her schooling at the University of Pennsylvania, UVA, and then also did her training at both Cornell and Columbia New York Presbyterian. She's an NIH-funded researcher focusing on pain and sedation, and many people know her really across the world through her Instagram presence. So social media, of course, has a huge presence in today's world, both professionally and personally, and she has been a huge advocate both for patients, whether it's on vaccines, or the latest treatments. And then personally, she's known for her fertility journey and is now a new mom. So we are particularly thankful for her taking the time to give us this important lecture today. So as an academic physician, she of course is very aware of these struggles, and then as a new mom has had to balance all of that. So very excited to hear what Dr. Patel has to share with us, and I will let her take it from here.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Anjali, for asking me to talk. Just a little side note, Anjali and I actually met through social media and have become very much real life friends. So I just wanted to say thank you for this great opportunity.
Yeah, of course.
All right. So it's actually very interesting. This talk was really born from a post that I did on my social media. What I'll be discussing today is really the plight of women in academic medicine in the time of COVID-19. And you'll see that there are themes that far predated COVID that are really now amplified. Oops, sorry about that. So Anjali very eloquently talked about my training, so I don't have to go through that. What I will say is that I am one of those people that have wanted to be a physician my entire life. And my pursuit of academic medicine has also really been a guiding force in my life. And I started research actually in high school. I worked at the NIH in a lab, and I continued that lab research through undergraduate. But it was really in residency at Cornell that I really dove deep into clinical research, where I helped develop a screening tool for ICU delirium in kids. I was really lucky at that point in my life to have a mentor who was actually not only a woman in medicine, but she was also a mom. And in making this talk, I realized I was very involved and actually ran the study for a period of time because my mentor went on maternity leave with her 4th child right when we were getting our study running. So again, I was one of those few lucky ones that had a strong female mentor early in my medical academic career. And she really instilled in me that it was possible to do both. Now, sort of many years later, I don't want to say how many, I do know that it is possible, but it does not come without its significant challenges. So in addition to my academic career and clinical career, as Anjali mentioned, I am a new mother, and she'll actually be 2 months old tomorrow. So in addition to navigating the pandemic as a woman in academic medicine, I'm also navigating the pandemic as a new mother. And she has really brought on and brought to light the challenges that mothers face in sort of this new work from home culture. And that is really the reason why I'm giving this talk. So, you know, as Anjali mentioned, I am quite active on social media, and one of my passions is really sharing what the real life of an academic doctor is, and particularly a woman in academic medicine. And you'll see sort of in some later slides that there truly is a paucity of women in academics, and particularly later in later stages of their academic careers, there's a significant fall off. And you know, one of the things that I feared personally when I worked quite hard to get pregnant, as Anjali mentioned as well. I did share that I went through IVF to have my child, Sita. So it was a long path. But along the way, you know, it was not lost upon me that, you know, having a kid and also balancing a career in academics was not going to be easy. And, you know, for me, you know, just 2 weeks after having her, I will say I already had sort of this internal monologue of, you know, I need to get back to my research. I need to get back to my work. I have an NIH grant. It's a Early Career Award, KL2. Unfortunately, I had the type of grant that could not be paused when I went on maternity leave. I will say that there are many NIH grants that can be paused. But it's important to know that for me, the clock did not stop. So although I'm on maternity leave, my grant funding I knew was going to end in actually June. So I've been on this grant for 2 years. So in order to sort of plan for my maternity leave and plan for another year of funding, I ended up applying for a 1-year renewal of this grant. That renewal happened to come when I was 35 weeks pregnant and also managing 40 to 50 kids in the ICU. But, you know, we got it done. I got it done. And I was really lucky and found out a couple of days after giving birth to Sita that I got the 1-year grant extension. You'd think that would make me feel better and that I would take this maternity leave off, but, you know, with each grant that you get, you know, you have to plan for the next. And that's one of the reasons why I, you know, have been attending research meetings while on maternity leave, and I've started my writing as well. You know, and this is all coming from me. It's not someone telling me to do it, but you know, any pauses in productivity in academics can come to your detriment. And I think that this is one of the fundamental issues for women in academic medicine and why we are facing these challenges. I'd be remiss not to mention that there's a long history of this beyond academic medicine. And one of the seminal books that brought to light this issue was called The Second Shift by Arlie Hochschild. This was published in 1989, and it followed 50 families from the 70s to the 80s. And this is one of the first books that really followed women who had entered the workforce and highlighted the fact that, you know, not only were they doing all this paid labor during the day, but then they had a whole second wave of labor when they came home, and this involved both household and childcare duties. And, you know, in going into this, we should expand upon it. So what are these duties beyond just taking care of children in the household? And these can be really broken down into both what have been coined invisible labor and emotional labor. And invisible and emotional labor both go into play with this body of literature is titled the mental load. Invisible labor, I'm sure a lot of you guys can identify with this, involves planning, details, logistics, organization, making appointments. And emotional labor is really taking people's emotional temperature and making sure that everyone is heard and their needs are met. Now, I hate making generalities, but, you know, both in literature and in personal experience, I can say that, you know, women have a tendency to take on these roles, not only at home, but also in the workplace. And we'll go into sort of what plays into academic advancement shortly. But as you can imagine, both invisible and emotional labor not only take a lot of physical time, but they also take a lot of mental energy. And when it comes to academic promotion, you know, the term publish or perish really is paramount. It's the publications and the funding that are advancing people's career. No one's taking into account this incredible toll that this invisible and emotional labor take on people. And unfortunately, the time that's spent on both of these forms of work really are not taken into account when it comes to promotion. So what is the cause beyond just domestic work and caring responsibilities that cause the gender inequities in academic medicine? So there's constant discouragement from teachers, family, and society to pursue careers in STEM. There's lack of role models and mentorship. There can be hostile and abusive work environments for females. And also just subsequent inequality in hiring, publishing pay, service loads, grants, and then all of these lead to inequality in, you guessed it, promotion. So, and then there is, at the beginning of one's academic career, this is sort of one of the most challenging times that one faces. And for me, this was without a doubt the hardest time of my life, because you are pressured to establish your research and also your position in the field. And particularly if you're going down the NIH grant pathway, you have 5 years after your last postdoctoral fellowship to get an NIH mentored career grant. And these mentored career grants are really sort of prized possessions because they protect your time. Basically what they do is because I have this grant, 75% of my time, my year, is devoted to research, and my grant pays for that time. And then I devote 25% to clinical. And again, the clock starts ticking the second you end your last fellowship. So if you have a child, the NIH has made concessions and gives you 1 year, but it doesn't matter how many children you have in that 5-year time period, you get 1 year added to that clock. So unfortunately, we know now this time at the beginning of one's academic career really does coincide with your reproductive window. And that's where the term the maternal wall, mommy track, the motherhood penalty, or the baby penalty has all come into play. The New England Journal of Medicine published an article in 2010 that also highlighted the fact that although that there was an increased number of females entering into the medical field, there was a drastic reduction in the number of women that were actually advancing. So I'd like to focus first on the figure on the left. So particularly looking at the fields of OBGYN and pediatrics. So, you know, we know that these are fields that are in general dominated by women. And as you can see in the number of women who are residents that entered the field during the study period, and I believe it was from 2008 to late 2009, there's a significantly greater number of women over men that entered the field. But then when you look at how many actually advanced to full professor, it was a very small percentage. The bar right next to the female professor is the number of male professors. And in both cases, it was almost 4 times the number of male professors to females, despite the fact that the overall fields were dominated by women. And in the graph next to that, you're looking at the number of medical students and showing that although the percentage of women that were entering the medical field increased exponentially, when you look at productivity work products, the number of first authors and senior authors that were women are dramatically reduced from the number that actually entered the medical field. So again, although women are actually dominating the field of medicine, we're not dominating in academic advancement. And I really like this graph because it shows where they're falling off. So this was out of the AAMC. It was a report in 2015, which looked at sort of how women were advancing in the field of academic medicine. And what I've highlighted here is the subtotal of all the percentage of women that entered into academic medicine. So 57% of all people that entered academic medicine during the study period were actually women, and they entered at the clinical instructor level. However, you'll see then that at every step of advancement, you're losing at least 10% of the female workforce. So from going from clinical instructor to assistant professor, we've dropped off already from 57% of the workforce as women to 45%. And then from assistant professor to associate professor, you've dropped from 45 to 35%, to the final reduction from 35 to 22%. And this has really broad implications, because not only have we shown that these women have dropped off in terms of they're not advancing in their careers from an academic standpoint, but now you've also reduced the number of females that can be mentors to the younger generation. So during COVID-19, I've talked about sort of what are these gender inequalities. There are some new issues, but fundamentally they're the same issues, but just amplified. And we've seen this in the news. Women in science are battling COVID-19 and the patriarchy, the pandemic and the female academic, the impact of COVID-19 on academic mothers, and it really goes on. So what is the problem? I'm going to give a couple quotes from an article from Alessandro Manello. She's a social demographer out of Italy, and she published a really interesting piece in Nature Medicine in May. So the first thing is the inequity of childcare responsibilities at home. She reports, since COVID-19 closed my university on March 12th, I've seen more sunrises than in the rest of my previous life. Now I must be at work before daybreak, and my son is 2 years old. And really what she's saying is that she's working in the morning and the evening. And there was another study that revealed that male faculty during this pandemic are 4 times more likely to have a partner engaged in full domestic care than their female colleagues. So what this is saying is that although there may be dual physician households, the females much greater than males are taking on the brunt of childcare. And then beyond that, just the emotional labor. So colleagues located around the globe who have had an atavistic desire to meet face-to-face online at any hour of the day. This means I have less time for writing scientific articles. Instead of working, my colleagues and I are aiming to make it through daily life. And I really think this hit upon the emotional labor piece. You know, since I've been on maternity leave, you know, I've been checked in on by almost every single one of my my women in medicine colleagues at my job. And I can't say that I've been called by any of my male colleagues. And this is really just an example of how women really are taking the emotional temperature of the room. They're making sure that everyone's okay. And we talked about invisible labor. You know, I can say one of my close friends is running simulations on COVID-19 to make sure that we can take, you know, good care of our patients. She's not going to write a paper on those simulations for COVID, but it's for the greater good of the group. And again, it's not going to help with her academic promotion, but it is helping the group as a whole. And unfortunately, these are roles that women are taking more often over males. And when it comes down to their academic promotion, these are going to be gaps in their resume. And then finally, we have to think that there's not only a short-term, but a long-term implications to this work from home and sort of the inequalities in both home care and the inequalities in the roles that we're taking in our clinical and academic groups. So this pandemic can teach some of us an important lesson. Mothers and fathers together are facing a short-term reorganization of care and work time. In the long run, these changes in productivity will affect careers. Will anyone in the academic community take into account our unbalanced approach to family care and work? No. All of us will participate together in open competition for promotion and positions, parents and non-parents alike. And you know, this comes to light then what has COVID-19 brought that's unique to these inequalities. And we've seen this in the research world. Even if you're not in the research world, you can't ignore the fact that there's been an incredible rapid increase in the quantity and speed of available data, which has led to accelerated peer review and article dissemination. And this has really been out of a necessity. We want to learn more about COVID-19 so that we can save lives. With this has become new and expanded funding accessibility, But the thing is that with all of this sort of accelerated publication and funding, this has now implications both on short and long-term academic careers. I go back to publish or perish, which still remains a central tenet of academic promotion and scientific funding. And if someone like me is not publishing during this sort of accelerated time of academic productivity, what am I going to do when I am being compared with someone who was not on maternity leave during COVID-19, who was able to publish 5 papers when I didn't publish any? You know, I'm going to be compared against that person. And I think when people are really talking about the long-term implications, this is what they're referring to. Now, you know, people felt that this was happening, but then actual journals were stating that there's been a rapid downtick in women submitting publications. So there have been actually 2 studies. This Vincent Lamar study was one of them that reported the number of female first authors who were being published in these preprint repositories. And I'd like to focus on MedRx, which is in blue. And this is the major preprint publication repository for medical papers. BioRx really focuses on more just science and not specific to medicine. And you'll see that at the beginning, in July of 2019, 40% of all preprint publications had female first authors. You come down to April 2020, and it's down to 20%. It has been cut in half. And this really, I'd like to focus on, again, the MedRx. This is looking not only at pre and post pandemic, but also from 2019, February to January and February of 2020. And there's already been a downtick, not only in just this current acute period of time, but actually from 2019 to 2020. So again, there's going to be long-term implications to sort of the reduction in publication of women in medicine. So is there a solution? I think that's where we need to focus on now. This was a quotation from the Lamar article that I just showed you the diagrams from. The pandemic will subside, but these inequities will not. A long-term commitment to equity in science will help us to not only survive this crisis, but to be stronger when we emerge. So at this point, I'd love to hear from you guys. I do have 2 more slides on possible solutions, but when I posted about how women in academic medicine are suffering, I posed the question, how can we solve this problem? Both related to the pandemic, but also unrelated to the pandemic. And I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this before I share my own thoughts and also some thoughts from my followers. And actually,
Anita, I guess in that same vein, because you're talking about solutions, has the NIH come out with any statements on, you know, like you say, they might offer a year for, you know, for new moms,
yeah.
and that 5-year plan. So have they come out with any statements on how they might be offering some sort of concessions, given that this has put such a strain on everyone?
Not yet. Now there have been some short-term fixes, rather. So they have delayed there have been some deadlines during the pandemic that they have pushed. But in terms of any sort of long-term, how are we going to look at this once the pandemic is over? There's been no solutions. They've all been short-term fixes.
And has there been any like large consensus of women in medicine or you know, women and men in medicine, like at least sort of petitioning or writing or bringing it to their attention? I mean, it should be at their attention already, but has there been any discussion about sort of asking / demanding for those types of concessions?
Not organized, no. And it needs to happen, obviously, but nothing that has been organized. And I see someone, yes, I just unmuted.
Is it me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for this, very important topic. And, really, I think the issue is more, it's not just women, it's really mothers in medicine, because I talk to my female colleagues who don't have children. And just the other day, I was catching up with one colleague and she said, "Oh, I've been so productive. I've gotten out 4 papers and, I've rested, I exercise, like all these great things, like we're supposed to take care of ourselves." And I was like, "Oh, I trained my daughter not to, put her hand in the toilet and, crayons aren't food, and, tried to help my son through his, work from home, homeschooling, like all of those things. And, made it to all my Zoom meetings, but, did you actually get out the currency of academics, which is not that. There's not a section on your CV to say, like, what are your parenting wins for today? Like I can't list all those, like I need to list what journal published my paper that I did not submit. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
I think until, I'm thinking, I don't want to sound like a cynic, but I'm thinking about your question, like, how can it be changed? And I, I don't know. I think it would really take a fundamental change in the evaluation process of what, what is considered currency of academics. And in the end, it's going to be papers and grants. And I feel quite discouraged to see, how are we really going to be able to change that?
Yeah.
Sometimes people say, and like you said, I appreciate that and I'm sorry I'm going on, but I appreciate your, being open about, working to have a baby. And, I think that's a situation for a lot of women, planning families, working towards families, IVF, or, all these things that we're trying to achieve. And sometimes the attitude is like, well, this is what you wanted, right? Like that's what you were working for. You wanted your family. So here's your family,
Absolutely. Yeah.
it's kind of like, of course I love my family. I love my children. But does that mean my career, has to suffer also? It's definitely a very difficult thing to weigh.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So we can maybe type the rest of the questions in, and then that way, because there's so many different, so that Dr. Patel doesn't have to continue to unmute people. If you want to type them into that chat below, then I can make sure to share them for everyone.
And how about while Anjali's doing that, I'll propose a couple potential solutions that came from myself and actually also from this post that I did on Instagram. And a lot of really astute and intelligent women made some great suggestions. So, I split it into how can we sort of fix, or are there any solutions related to COVID-19? And in the non-medical sector, there's been a lot of questions, particularly in there was a couple of economists and political papers that mentioned a potential pause on publication. Obviously, this is absolutely not possible and not appropriate in medicine. We need this information on COVID-19 out as soon as possible so that we can help patients. So not an option. The next one is really something that I think, a lot of us have thought about, but standardizing publishing requirements for academic advancement based on care responsibilities during the pandemic. And I know you had mentioned motherhood, and beyond motherhood also, some people are in charge of their elderly parents or anyone with any sort of care responsibilities, really standardizing. So I'm required to do 3 papers in the next year, and the person with no care responsibilities is in charge of, for example, 5. So really trying to fix or create a standardized way of academic career advancement based on your life as well. Another thing is if you're on the tenure track clock, doing a pause on the tenure track clock based on how long we're working from home and sort of the recovery period for that. And obviously that would need to take into account when are kids going back to work, because just because we're required to go back to work doesn't mean that, our kids are. and also the sharing of the invisible and emotional labor in the workplace during this pandemic. And I feel like I keep coming back to that because it's something that I have experienced personally, and also I've seen my close friends who've really taken on the lion's share of these tasks and this even predated the pandemic. And, you know, they were doing things that were clearly not going to advance their careers, but they were doing it for the greater good of the group and also the greater good of our patients. And really the next thing is, what about beyond the pandemic? And many of these responses came from my followers. So, and I think I put the first one there first because it came from a lot of people: mandatory paternity leave. And this makes so much sense. You know, I decided to take 2.5 months for my maternity leave, although I guess I'm doing research now, so that is moot. But, you know, if there's a mandatory paternity leave, this is a shared responsibility. My husband, who is a human rights lawyer and would love to have taken a real paternity leave, he didn't get any. And so he took 2 weeks of his vacation to be home with me, and then because of COVID, he happens to be home, but he's required to be, you know, really at the office, even though he's home. So it's really fallen upon me to do this. So if we had a required paternity leave, there would be no question about whether they were going to take it or not, and this would be a shared model. So these quote unquote, I currently feel like there's a delay in my career. I wouldn't feel that way if everyone is experiencing this, if they chose to have children. Also, you know, it always needs to be a top-down approach. Leadership acknowledgement that this is happening, and a commitment to restructuring career advancement is really required. Women releasing themselves from the pressure to do it all. So, you know, I don't want to say that all this is coming from men. You know, a lot of it is coming from ourselves as well. As I said, I was the one that sort of jumped back into my my research meetings because I felt like I didn't want to delay my career advancement. We talked about the emotional and invisible labor. And also, so this was something really interesting that someone brought up. Academics need to take into account the fundamental differences in child rearing, such as breastfeeding, when considering what a full-time equivalent is. And one follower had mentioned that, you know, if we're required to pump 3 or 4 times a day, that should be a reduction in our day and a reduction in our clinical requirements. Women need to mentor and empower women. That is always necessary. And another person had mentioned academics should provide child or home help for new mothers. So again, these all came from my followers, and I kind of just summed them together. I'd love to hear from you guys now.
So I have actually gotten a few comments. One definitely supported the concept of the mandatory paternity leave, but said that, you know, some men might feel guilty taking that. I guess part of that is the ingrained culture of seeing it as a weakness, or just feeling like it's their responsibility to be at work. And 2 different people, one said, you know, that we need to be including men in this conversation because, of course, women in medicine have these discussions. And then, you know, without the men being on board, it's hard to make any changes. While another commented, a special thanks to some of the men who are in the crowd today. So special recognition to our male colleagues who have joined us tonight. So what are your thoughts then on men who would see their sharing the load or taking paternity leave as a weakness, or you know, them taking away from the team?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a fundamental problem. And I have to be honest, I would even take men out of that. You know, when I was thinking about my maternity leave, I felt guilty for taking more than the 6 to 8 weeks. Like, I truly did. And so I can only imagine that because of sort of societal pressures, that is amplified in men. So I think that goes back to the word, I put it in capital letters, mandatory. I think it would only work if it was mandatory. Because if it wasn't mandatory, I don't think men would even take it I think not all, and I think my husband would, but, you know, I don't think that all men would take it, honestly, because they would sort of fall into those pressures. So mandatory for both men and, you know, as women, we have to take it because we have to recover. But, you know, I felt pressure even for myself to go back as early as possible. So I can only imagine those pressures are amplified for men who are not physically giving labor.
Right. And what, I guess, you know, we're talking about solutions. So if women want to be proactive when they're looking into, you know, academic appointments, or even if they're, you know, looking into residencies where they may want to stay on as faculty, do you have any advice on how to craft the conversations that might then set them up for success?
Yeah, so I will say one thing that I did when I was looking for my first job out of training, you know, in research, it's hard to find a mentor to mentor you. So I didn't expect that my direct research mentor had to be a woman. But what I did look at was the greater group. Number one, were women actually performing research in the group? And also, did women have families? Because I think, you know, if there are no examples of that in the group that you're entering, then that is, that could be, I'm not saying it absolutely is, but it could be a reflection of the culture. And, you know, as I mentioned, I work at Children's National, and there were actually almost all the women had 2 to 3 children and were still doing research. And for me, you know, again, my mentor actually happens to be a over 70-year-old male who is very supportive of my research career, obviously. But the fact is that I have those women to talk to. In fact, I talked to one earlier today, you know, and help navigate the specific challenges of funding now that I have a kid and the time clock and all those things. So for me, it was really important to have those examples of women that I wanted to emulate in the group that I was entering, so that I knew it was actually possible and functional in that group. So that would be a really practical piece of advice for younger women.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. I'm in radiology, so I'm in what is often considered a male-dominated field. As a breast imager, that's less of the case, but I ended up choosing a residency that had a lot of strong female leadership because I felt like that would be more conducive to a balanced lifestyle, which I do think ended up being the case. We had a lot of residents who had children during residency, and that was supported, which is not often the case in situations like residency. And another comment on radiology, because one of the participants commented childcare at medical conferences is a great way to support physicians. Yeah. And I completely agree. And actually last year, the American College of Radiology offered that for the first time, where they had childcare. And part of that is because the president or the head of the board of chancellors was a female. And so she really instituted a lot of changes and advancements within the college, and promoted it, you know, across radiology to try to be more receptive to parents and, you know, female colleagues and their needs. So, you know, and when you talk about breastfeeding, I mean, we're still trying to get, you know, pumping rooms, right, for women. So, yeah. Of course, acknowledging that that's even a struggle for women is a few steps down the line.
Yeah. I had no idea how hard it was until I entered upon the field, and now I have a newfound respect for mothers.
No, absolutely. And as someone who, you know, of course, in research days there might be a little bit more flexibility, but when you're in your clinical you know, position, you're obviously go. So that's gonna that affects our clinical workload as well, and so. So this is sort of affecting both. We did get a comment about, you know, sort of being okay, making some accommodation, and retiring as a tenured academic associate professor. And certainly, you know, that's a laudable career track. So what would your comment be? You know, should women sort of make that compromise? What's your thoughts on that?
You know, I simultaneously totally agree in a lot of ways. You know, as long as you're producing what you'd like to produce and making the impact that you'd like to make, then what does it matter, right? But I think on the flip side, why, there are fundamental biological reasons why I had to stay home. I had a cesarean section, so I was recovering for the first month. Couldn't, even if I wanted to go to work, I couldn't. And so I guess I would throw back to that then, why should I be the only one to take a penalty for that, month or two of academic pause? I guess my question would be, why can we not level the playing field? So again, I guess that's a little bit of a hedged answer, but I think ultimately it comes to impact and helping the field. And, hopefully most of us who are in research, that's why we go into it, because we want to leave the field better than when we entered it. But at the same time, why shouldn't we enjoy the same sort of fruits of our labor that our male counterparts do? And again, if we can just level the playing field based on requiring both of us to take leave, that would be such an easy way of leveling the playing field and not having to say, okay, because you had 2 kids, you only have to publish this much, and the other person has to publish so much. That gets into very murky territory that even I might not be, how do you make those decisions? So I think taking 10 steps back and looking at leave and division of labor and those types of things are really where I think we can make lasting change.
Right. So for some, some of the participants might be earlier on in their training and not have gone through the grant application process, et cetera. So you mentioned that there's inequities even just in, who the genders, gap between who's given.
Yeah.
So has there ever been any discussion on blinding the application? So, because again, it's in the end, it should just be about the research and the researcher in the sense of their capabilities and their experience, and not their gender.
Yeah. Yes. So in the early stages of most grant applications, there is a lot of blinding. However, when it comes down to actually choosing applicants, so much is based on their history, who their mentors are, and often you have people within the field who are looking at these applications. So fully blinding them is almost next to impossible. I think that's what it goes down to. Again, first passes through applications can be blinded, and I think in certain institutions they are, in certain institutes of health they are, but it is not that way across the board, and I think it comes down to sort of how small many of these fields are. If we could blind it more, that would be so helpful, but unfortunately, I think it's because they're so specialized, they're not always blinded.
Right. We got a comment that you're a wonderful research mentor.
I just saw that. Thank you, Dada. You don't need that much mentoring.
So you mentioned, and I mean, I don't want to take away from if you have any other remaining slides.
No. I think the last slide was just where to find me, so please.
So you mentioned the 5-year track on the NIH grants, and that yours in particular was one that could not be paused. Are there grants that can be paused, or was it just that reference to the 1 year that the NIH allows for women early on in their career?
So yeah, I think maybe I wasn't clear. So there's 2 issues. Number one, when you have a grant, can it be paused when you're on maternity leave? And so I did some research on the NIH website when I was making this talk, because I was surprised that my grant couldn't be paused. And the truth is that a lot of the grants can be paused for a maximum of 3 months. And then it's after that you have to get special concessions. Now, my grant is a K, so it's an early career award grant. As I said, it's special in that you get a lot of protected time. 75% of my time is protected. That's where the early what is considered an early career comes into play. That is 5 years after your last fellowship. So that could be residency, it could be fellowship. So whenever your training ended, the clock starts. That's the clock that's the most trickiest, because everyone wants to be on these K grants because they give you, that amount of protected time. But the only pause that is sort of embedded in the, and given to the NIH to mothers is really this 1 year time period. After that, you need to apply for special concessions. And there's a specific line on the NIH website that says you get 1 year no matter how many, essentially, I'm paraphrasing it, but you get 1 year no matter how many children you have. Right. And that's a big deal because it's really hard to advance on the NIH grant pathway unless you do each stage. So getting the K really sets you up to get the R, which is like sort of the next mature phase of grants. And from the R, you go to the U. So skipping any of those stages makes it that much harder to get the next grant. So again, we've already talked about this, but that was my reproductive window. So I didn't have a choice. I was going to have if I wanted to have a kid, I was likely going to have a kid during the K. And that's okay. That's what, making it work. But it also meant that I felt that pressure to get back to my research a little earlier than, maybe I had planned.
Right. And I mean, I think if you want women, I guess if women want to be more productive as individuals, they obviously have to, figure out how to make that work-life fit. But if it's institutions that are looking for women to be more productive, then obviously they need to be more supportive, whether it's childcare, breastfeeding, or things that, can support both home and career. Yeah. So, you've been speaking largely towards publications, research, but what about teaching responsibilities and any impacts that being a female, do you feel perhaps you play a mentor role more than some of your male colleagues?
So I think, and this really goes back to sort of that emotional and invisible labor. I do think that, I don't want to say that I play more of a mentor role. I think the way in which we mentor is different, right? We're not just looking at, okay, how many papers did you publish, but are you doing okay? And, again, I think overwhelmingly women are making sure that the group as a whole are okay. And, when you were asking about sort of teaching responsibilities and academic advancement. So as part of our academic packet that we submit to sort of climb the ranks from assistant to associate, blah, 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 teaching is a part of it, but unfortunately it's a really small part. And I think it's because it's somewhat unquantifiable. We submit we give lectures and we submit our reviews from that lecture. But when it comes down to it, and it's not a large part of academic promotion in most universities, it really is, what have you produced? Not necessarily what have you added to the greater good of the group. And I think that's another reason why a lot of women in medicine sort of are hampered by all these invisible acts that we're doing that are not helping us advance our careers.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, publish or perish is part of why I had not ever been interested in academic medicine. I enjoy teaching and I enjoy clinical medicine. And I mean, those are both great things that a lot of people don't enjoy. And so one would think that, academic settings might value someone who would be willing to take on those roles and offer, others more time to publish, but the idea that everyone needs to be on this, publication grant route, I think is a little bit ill-conceived.
Yeah. it's striking because then you have departments where, you know, they're struggling to cover the clinical load, you know, so there's issues with everything. And clearly you need educators and you need researchers and you need clinicians, and some people are lucky to be able to be really good at them all. And you know, a lot of us are good at, you know, 2 out of the 3 or whatever it is. But not to say that there aren't roles for that in departments. I think the issue is that those roles don't lead to advancement in people's careers, and it leads to stagnation, and then stagnation leads to people leaving the field, you know, so that, I think that's the fundamental problem.
Right.
Yeah.
So advocacy obviously being a huge part of MSDC's goals. You know, we talked about, has there been any consensus as to whether the NIH should change its policies? But I think within departments and then in umbrella organizations like the AMA and et cetera, you know, there needs to be a little bit more advocacy for women or parents or families or just everyone in general, particularly for times like this, right? We've always had FMLA in the working environment in the United States, but I mean, it's almost like the whole country needs FMLA right now. And so, you know, the allowances for how to manage a situation like this, this COVID has obviously highlighted the sore need for sick leave, for care, for the imbalances, et cetera. So perhaps there needs to be a little bit more advocacy on that front.
And not just, you know, sick leave, you know, I have a lot of sick leave, but also comfortability taking that sick leave too, right? Like, I mean, how many of us have not taken, you know, I have months of sick leave that I just haven't taken. So it's really a full culture change to not only have the accessibility of these items, but also the comfortability and the culture to be able to take them too.
Right. And someone was commenting on, you know, it's not even just the research and the NIH grants, it's also the pressure to be on hospital committees, networking, these after work, you know, the after work events where the workday extends to like, you know, 9 and 10 p.m. between meetings and stuff. And personally, I've found at least the Zooms or the, you know, the conference calls for me have worked because at least I get to be home, or, you know, I can take a conference call and walk around the neighborhood and not be stuck in some, you know, steakhouse until 9 p.m., you know, 30 minutes from my home. So I think that COVID has offered some flexibility in that way, but it has also increased the reliance on these teleconference meetings, and sometimes now all of us have like, you know, 3, 4 in a day, and it's just adding and increasing that workload. So
I love this chat, by the way, guys. It's wonderful. I'm reading all of them.
Yeah, exactly. Someone's cooking dinner right now. Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing, is it's the good and the bad of the Zoom, right? Is that you can do other things while you're doing this, but also it is one more thing to have to do. So, well, if there are no other questions, I'll give another minute or so for questions, but Pia, did you have any other announcements to wrap up?
We just wanted to thank everyone for being part of the webinar tonight. I am going to send out a survey and would ask everyone to respond to that. If you want to like us on social media, please do. We offer these webinars every Wednesday, and we will do that throughout the COVID pandemic and possibly beyond. So if there's a topic that you really think we should be addressing, please share the topic with us so that we can make it happen.
Absolutely, I echo that. Dr. Aramburu, myself, and Pia are always trying to brainstorm topics that we think would be relevant to the community as a whole, but we definitely welcome your suggestions. And if that's it, I do want to thank, I asked one earlier. Do you think progress is being made, Dr. Patel?
I wish I could say that I think that there's progress, but unfortunately, I think the pandemic has revealed to us that not enough progress has been made, honestly. I mean, there's just the dichotomy of publication between male and female is striking. Do I think there's been progress over the past 10 years? Absolutely. And the numbers reflect that. But it's really, what is progress from what? It was pretty dire before. So I think you have to look at where you're growing from. And I don't think it's hopeless. I really don't. And I think just having conversations like this is such an important starting off point. And as I said, that I'm not the only woman who is doing research and where I work. So there are a lot of us in the field, and I think using forums like this, using social media to connect those women is the most important part, because I'd like to put a plug. There's even a Facebook group for mothers in academic medicine, and I remember I think 4 or 5 days into my maternity leave, I posted in that, joined and posted in that group saying, I feel pressure to go back to my work, and all the women in that group supported me. So, using whatever tools you have to connect to women, it's just important, because when you see someone who's walked a path that you want to walk, it makes it that much easier to follow.
Yeah, I agree.
Done.
So I have, do you think that women should keep bringing up, one person asked, do you think women should keep bringing up these issues? And another person asked, do you think it affects advancement if you do bring up these issues?
I think that's a big, I think there's a potential, and that's why there needs to be a critical mass of women talking about it for it to be heard and for it to not be able to be ignored or hamper our career advancement. I think that's the fear of all women, right? Is if we are too vocal about this, that, it'll be, I don't even want to say the words, that it'll hurt us. But again, if you achieve a critical mass, they can't ignore and they can't hold all of us back, right? So it just goes back to the fact that if we band together and help each other out, I do think that it's possible, but we need to reach that critical mass.
And I know we talk about this a lot on social media. Do you think that women can have it all?
I do. I think we just each need to have our own version of what it all means. And I think we also have to accept that it all is going to change at every stage of our lives. It definitely has for me. Just this morning, I had this talk and I had to prepare a research proposal for this pediatric issue that we're dealing with right now. And you know what? I was like, I would like to spend time with my daughter because she's awake in the morning and she's smiling and she's happy. And I never thought that having it all would fit into it, but that is what it is now for me. And so it's changing. So I do, but I think we just have to be fluid about it.
Yeah. My 2 comments on that, I think one of our mutual friends, I say friends, on social media, will say you can have it all, just not all at once, right?
Yes.
So you can have it all in your basket, but you can only juggle a couple at a time. The other thing, I asked you what time you wanted to schedule this. You're a new mom, and whereas, I'm someone who, as soon as I get off work, could, in theory, tune in. And I sent this to every female physician I could think of in DC. And one of them, who has 3 children, is a working mom, obviously, emailed me back and said, I registered, but 5:30 is a really hard time for moms. And my response to her was like, dial in if you can, don't if you can't, but a new mom picked this in the sense that it's not going to be the same for everyone. It doesn't matter what the situation is, when the situation is, the same thing doesn't work for everybody.
Yeah.
And so I do think that we have to recognize that, right? Whether it's in academics, in private practice, in all of our different roles, we have to stop thinking that one size fits all.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And it's going to change again at each stage of our lives, at each stage of the kids' lives, COVID, non-COVID, it's all fluid. So I totally agree.
Well, I think this has been really great. Obviously, if there are any continued questions, I'm sure if you forward them to Pia, we can have those addressed. But otherwise, special thank you to Dr. Patel. Go get some baby cuddles in.
Thank you so much.
Before she has her nightly breakdown.